On the beautiful Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941, a U.S. naval base on the Hawaiian island of Oahu was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan. Thousands of sailors and civilians perished, and the United States was immediately brought into the largest war in human history. Decades later, it is remembered as a day that will live in infamy, which is a direct quote from President Franklin Roosevelt after the attack. Pearl Harbor was where the Second World War began for the United States and would later play a major role in the Allied victory over the Axis alliance.
Prior to the attacks, the Empire of Japan was a growing militaristic nation who quickly sought to imperialize the Asian Pacific. After centuries of isolationism from most of the world, Japan quickly industrialized and mimicked concepts of those in European nations in the late 19th century, which began their desires for an imperial expansion. Another reason for Japanese imperialism was for resources. Mainland Japan is approximately the same size as the state of California, meaning there were lack of resources on such a small island that had much larger aspirations than it could hold. Japan shared similar beliefs with Italy and Germany, who all signed the mutual agreements, like the Anti-Comintern Pact, among the nations before forming the Axis powers in 1940. This was a strategy German dictator Adolf Hitler used to open two potential fronts for the Soviet Union to fight if they eventually declared war on each other.
With World War II beginning in Europe, Japan quickly invaded many Pacific islands that were controlled or colonized by the Allied nations. With the neutral United States watching from aside, they quickly imposed an oil embargo of 90% all exports going into Japan because they felt threatened of possible invasion on American territories in the Pacific. This embargo enraged Japan because they knew it would not be possible to expand their sphere of influence in the Asian nations. Japan was beginning to feel as they were not as successful as their allies in Europe, so they quickly had to come up with a plan. They needed to somehow obtain those sweet raw materials needed for their relentless military to achieve such victories. In Europe, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, which brought the Soviet Union into the war. Hitler begged Japan to assist in the invasion, but with the embarrassing deficit of supplies and resources, they could not afford to risk the forces they had.
Japan knew it had to expand to the south if they ever wanted to obtain enough raw materials for their military. Britain and the U.S. had a much larger and more powerful navy than Japan, so the Japanese came up with a plan to buy more time for their invasions in the small island territories before retaliation against them. With most of the British Navy in the defense of the English Channel in Europe, the Japanese knew they would have to mainly fight the United States in the Pacific. Their plan was to eliminate the U.S. naval forces in Pearl Harbor, where most of the U.S. naval fleets and airplanes were based in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese achieved a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The strategy of their attacks came with waves of over 200 airplanes in each wave. After the second wave of the aircraft completed their attack, the Japanese withdrew the third wave because they no longer achieved surprise and feared a great resistance due to the unknown locations of the U.S. aircraft carriers. The Battle of Pearl Harbor lasted around 2 hours, damaged over 20 U.S. ships, and destroyed nearly 300 planes. Over 2,400 lives were lost in the assault, which was the largest single-day attack in terms of fatalities in the U.S. history prior to the September 11th attacks, 60 years later.
Though the United States lost many lives, ships, and airplanes during the attacks, the Japanese ultimately woke the sleeping giant that brought a powerful United States into the Second World War. The Japanese failed to sink or damage any U.S. aircraft carriers, and all but 3 ships damaged were able to set sail after a massive effort to repair and restore the ships. Americans came together in support of the war and joined the Allies to defeat the Axis powers. The U.S. would defend the rest of the island territories before beginning the island hopping campaign after achieving victory in Europe. American forces fought intense battles on every island, and, by the end of the war, would sink all Japanese carriers, battleships, and cruisers in the same strike force that was used to attack Pearl Harbor. To end the war without losing an estimated 3 million men, the United States would go and drop 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Japan unconditionally surrendered days after and was placed under United States military government. In America, World War II began at Pearl Harbor and ended in mainland Japan nearly 4 years later. For Japan, the beginning of the end of World War II also began at Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941 will always be an important day in American and world history. Though the attack on Pearl Harbor was a horrific act of war, it would later catapult the United States into being a global superpower due to the tremendous victory in World War II.